Hey guys, tonight we sink slowly into the musty halls and candlelit corridors of medieval Europe, where power rarely meant peace, and kings weren't always the noble sword-wielding types from storybooks. Sometimes they were, well, like King John. You're standing under gray skies, a drizzle soaking through your woolen cloak, trudging toward a crumbling castle where whispers outweigh loyalty. And yes, you probably won't survive this reign unless you're particularly good at avoiding taxes, betrayal, and awkward family dinners. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your city and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all drifting off from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive at a drafty stone corridor, footsteps echoing faintly against centuries-old walls. The year is 1205, and you've just entered the uneasy reign of King John of England. A monarch so despised, he inspired a villain in Robin Hood. Not even Shakespeare could romanticize this one. His nickname, John Lackland. Not exactly kingly, is it? That's because he was literally the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, which meant by birthright he got almost nothing. No land, no inheritance, just resentment and one massive chip on his royal shoulder. As you pass a rusting suit of armor, the smell of damp parchment and unwashed tunics fills the air. You're in John's inner court, where loyalty costs less than a flagon of ale and spies outnumber friends 3-1. King John's favorite pastime, taxing. Not the fun kind. Think your harvest is now mine, taxes. And if you're a baron, you get extra attention, forced loans, royal fines, and the occasional land seizure just because. Scientists still argue whether John's harshness was strategic desperation or plain incompetence. Either way, it wasn't helping. England, already stretched thin after years of crusades and civil wars, began to buckle under his rule. His northern territories in France gone. His alliance with the church, a disaster. In fact, John got into such a petty fight with the Pope over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury that the entire country was placed under interdict. Basically, no church services, no weddings, no last rites. Imagine being told your grandmother can't get buried properly because your king can't play nice with the clergy. You slip past a wall tapestry depicting a lion and a crown symbols that feel more ironic than majestic. John, paranoid and increasingly isolated, begins building castles not to defend the kingdom, but to protect himself from his own nobles. Some nights like this one, he barely sleeps. He scribbles angry letters, his wax seal melting unevenly in the candlelight, each message accusing someone of treason or plotting to overthrow him. A mainstream scientific fact for you, stress, particularly prolonged cortisol exposure, has been linked to impaired judgment and heightened aggression. It's likely John suffered from this. Chronic stress from losing his lands, facing constant threats, and clashing with nearly every institution could have pushed him into irrational governance. You can almost feel the tension in the room, like the walls themselves are holding their breath. Meanwhile, Barons England's medieval billionaires start whispering. In smoky chambers, filled with wine and whispers, they draft what becomes the Magna Carta in 1215. You duck behind a wooden beam to listen. The barons demand protections, no imprisonment without trial, no taxes without consent. Radical stuff at the time. John signs it under duress at Runnymede. Spoiler, he breaks almost every promise days later. Classic John. A quirky little tidbit. John supposedly lost the royal treasure. Literally, during a campaign in eastern England, his baggage train, including the crown jewels, is said to have sunk into a tidal marsh known as the Wash. To this day, no one has definitively found them. So, if you've ever lost your car keys and felt bad, don't. This guy misplaced the crown. By 1216, John's enemies are so numerous that the French crown sends a Prince Louis to claim the English throne. Yes, things got so bad, some English nobles preferred a French king. John dies suddenly during this chaos, likely of dysentery, though some whisper about poison or divine punishment. As you crouch beside the fireplace, where his final meal was served, lamprey pie of all things, you can smell the sour mix of fish, wine, and illness. It doesn't exactly inspire confidence in medieval cuisine. John's death doesn't end the strife, but it does let the kingdom exhale. His 9-year-old son, Henry III, takes the throne. For a brief moment, hope flickers like a candle, not yet snuffed out by the next generation of ambitious men with swords and titles. Back in the corridor, the chill seeps into your bones. The guards are half asleep, the walls damp with moss. You realize how fragile all of it was. Thrones, crowns, loyalty. Nothing ever secure, not even for kings. You rub your hands together, brushing soot from the torch brackets. Imagine being ruled by a man more hated than any foreign invader, a man who alienated nearly every ally and left behind only fractured laws and empty coffers. Yet, thanks to the Magna Carta, his failures accidentally birthed the idea of constitutional government. A man so bad at ruling, he stumbled into shaping modern democracy. Talk about falling upward. The debate among historians rages on, was John truly evil, or just incredibly unlucky and outmatched? Some blame his upbringing. Others say he was merely a medieval bureaucrat in a warrior's age. You, however, just know he makes an excellent cautionary tale, especially when your nightmares include tax audits, betrayal, and seafood pies. As you drift through the darkened corridors, the last image you see is John's tomb in Worcester Cathedral, where he lies awkwardly dressed in regal robes, his sword clasped tight as if still trying to defend his legacy. You wonder if he sleeps any better now than he did in life. You leave behind John's cold, echoing halls and step into a palace painted not in blood, but in layers of illusion and confusion. The air shifts thicker now, scented faintly with lavender and despair. You're in France, the late 14th century, and the crown sits uneasily on the head of Charles VI, a monarch remembered not for cruelty, but for madness, so complete it swallowed the court, the kingdom, and eventually himself. You shuffle down a corridor lined with portraits, some defaced, others eerily lifelike. One canvas shows Charles as a young, vibrant king, just 11, when he inherited the throne. His coronation had been dazzling, filled with golden robes and hopeful whispers. But now, as you peer around the velvet curtains of the Parisian court, the mood is different, duller, more careful, like everyone is waiting for something to break. And something does. You wake in the middle of a hot summer night to shouts and clattering hooves. Charles has bolted into the forest, not because of an enemy army, but because he believes his servants are plotting to kill him. Sword drawn, his face wild, he's striking down one of his own men. Then he collapses in a heap, trembling eyes unfocused. One of the first episodes, they'll say later. It won't be the last. As you wander the palace, everyone is whispering, but always behind fans or goblets. The courtiers walk like dancers, careful and smooth, trying not to spook their king. You pass the queen's chambers, Isabeau of Bavaria, young, intelligent, politically sharp. Her eyes carry a weight too heavy for her age. She's the real ruler now, and it shows in the way servants step twice as fast in her presence. Scientists still argue whether Charles suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or a rare form of encephalitis. What we know is this. He once believed he was made of glass. Yes, glass. He wore reinforced clothes, wouldn't let anyone touch him, and ordered special furniture so he wouldn't shatter. You step gingerly beside him in your mind's eye, watching him refuse hugs from his children, flinching from the breeze like it's a threat. It would be quirky if it weren't so tragic. One court physician suggested a cure of herbs boiled in wine. Another recommended trepanning, the charming medieval act of drilling a hole in the skull to let out bad spirits. You're pretty sure that wouldn't have helped. The court becomes a shadow play. Charles has lucid periods, and during these he seems almost normal, chess-playing, justice-giving, even affectionate. But then the darkness returns. He forgets his own name. He can't recognize his wife. During one attack, he believes he's St. George and orders everyone to kneel before him. You watch the nobles do it, not out of faith, but fear. No one wants to be next. You make your way to the grand hall where a feast is underway. It's the Bal des Ardents, the Ball of the Burning Men. It's meant to be fun. 6 courtiers dressed in wild man costumes covered in pitch and feathers meant to dance and shock the crowd. But someone brings a torch too close. Flames leap up, screams. 4 men burn alive, the smell of burning hair and cloth so thick it clings to the rafters. Charles survives, barely pulled under a cloak by one of his relatives. But he never fully returns from that night. The French people, already weary from war and famine, begin calling him Charles the Mad. He spends days muttering to himself, refusing to bathe, and pacing so furiously the castle walls need repadding. The 100 Years' War rages on beyond the palace gates. England takes advantage of the chaos. Joan of Arc is still a century away. Meanwhile, in one of the castle libraries, you notice something beautiful: illuminated manuscripts left untouched on thick wooden tables. The monks and scribes keep writing, documenting not just the madness but also moments of eerie calm. Poetry written in the margins, herbal diagrams, even a musical notation. You hum absent-mindedly, realizing no one's heard the tune in hundreds of years. A world within a world. A mainstream scientific fact for you here. Medieval chroniclers, though biased, were some of the earliest mental health journalists in history. Their detailed records of Charles VI's behavior, routines, delusions, patterns, give modern psychiatrists rare insights into how mental illness was perceived and treated long before neurology had a name. You drift toward the tower chamber, a place Charles liked in his quieter moments. A small harp sits untouched in the corner. There's a half-painted mural of a forest, the kind he liked to walk through before paranoia locked him indoors. The room smells faintly of beeswax and moss. For a moment, it's peaceful. Then a crash from below the court is arguing again. His brother Louis of Orleans and the powerful Duke of Burgundy are clawing for control behind the scenes. Charles, meanwhile, is in a trance, humming to no one. The fringe theory. Some scholars claim Charles may have been the unintended victim of mercury poisoning, either from ointments, herbal remedies, or contaminated water near his residences. Symptoms line up eerily well. Tremors, hallucinations, emotional instability. But no definitive proof has ever been found. Still, what's undeniable is the chaos. France spirals. The nobility fragments into bitter factions, each more interested in their power than the kingdom's survival. One by one, Charles' children are married off like pawns. Some go mad themselves. You begin to wonder if it's hereditary or just the curse of proximity to a court forever on the brink. As you slip into the stables, the horses are restless. Even they seem to sense the disorder. You spot a servant murmuring a bedtime story to calm on one of them. His voice, soft as hay, rustles beneath hooves. In a way, it's not that different from the stories they tell about Charles now, twisted fairy tales with a hint of horror and sorrow. You hear a child in the hallway, one of Charles's youngest sons, playing with a carved wooden lion. He asks the guard if his father will ever wake up. The guard doesn't answer. You feel something tighten in your chest. Not fear, just a strange, deep empathy. Even kings, especially kings, can break. When Charles finally dies in 1422, France is split and exhausted. His body is buried in the Saint-Denis Basilica with the rest of the Capetians, but his mind had left long before. You pass his tombstone in your thoughts, fingers brushing across the engraved name. Charles VI, King of France. Made of glass, and yet somehow unshatterable in history. You leave the palace quietly moonlight, glancing off stained glass windows that shimmer like broken promises. And you carry with you the haunting truth that sometimes the most terrible reigns aren't ruled with iron and fire, but with a whisper, a flicker of doubt, and the sound of a mind gently falling apart. Your boots sink into soft, damp earth as the landscape around you changes. The moon is high, veiled by streaks of mist, and ahead looms a crooked silhouette of a fortress stone, towers jutting like jagged teeth into the night. You're deep in 15th century Wallachia, and though your instincts tell you to turn back, something keeps pulling you forward. This is the land of Vlad III, better known as Vlad the Impaler, or if you want to be poetic and a little dramatic, Vlad Dracula. You tread carefully, because here, even the trees seem to whisper stories, some true, most terrifying. The wind carries the faint scent of pine decay and smoke. You shiver, not from cold, but from the weight of reputation. Vlad isn't your average medieval monarch. He's a walking campfire tale, equal parts national hero and nightmare fuel. But let's back up. You arrive at the gates of Targovishte, the princely capital where Vlad once ruled with such a uniquely brutal sense of justice that even his enemies were sometimes impressed. He came to power in a land constantly harassed by external threats, mostly the Ottoman Empire, and riven with internal betrayal. The boyars, or nobles, were slippery, manipulative, and often aligned with foreign powers. So Vlad did what any deeply paranoid, trauma-scarred, medieval ruler might do. He started impaling people. Yes, literally. That sharp wooden stake technique. That wasn't poetic license. It was real. As you approach the central square, you're surrounded by tall poles, some with vague human shapes, still slumped upon them. The smell is indescribable. There are no flies because the smoke from nearby fires keeps them away. It's quiet, too quiet. You try not to breathe through your nose. Vlad didn't invent impalement, but he sure perfected it. Long, slow, and terrifyingly precise. He reportedly arranged the impaled bodies by rank. The higher the nobility, the taller the stake. A quirky little tidbit: he once invited hundreds of boyars to a feast, only to have them arrested mid-meal and marched off to build his castle at Poenari, many dying in the process. No one ever accused him of half measures. Scientists still argue whether Vlad was truly sadistic or simply a traumatized tactician playing psychological warfare at an elite level. Remember, he'd been held hostage by the Ottomans as a teenager, alongside his brother, and possibly exposed to torture and intense political games from a young age. One theory suggests Vlad's brutality wasn't psychosis, it was a calculated response to unrelenting instability. Kill a few to save the many, in his view. Back in the forest, you walk along a path where Vlad reportedly hung the bodies of thieves and Turkish prisoners as warnings. But here's the twist: crime dropped dramatically under his rule. Merchants could leave gold in the streets without it being touched. There's even a story about a golden goblet left on a public fountain, untouched the entire time he ruled. So yes, people were terrified, but they were safe. In a perverse medieval way, Vlad got results. Let's bring in a mainstream scientific fact. Fear activates the amygdala, a small, almond-shaped part of your brain responsible for survival instincts. Under extreme fear, humans behave more predictably. Flight, freeze, or comply. Vlad exploited this neurobiology ruthlessly, even using it against invading armies. In 1462, when Sultan Mehmed II advanced into Wallachia, Vlad left thousands of impaled Ottoman corpses lining the road to Targovishte. Mehmed took one look and turned back. Talk about next-level home security. But Vlad wasn't just a warlord. He was also a man of letters, strange as it sounds. He wrote diplomatic dispatches, negotiated treaties, and even used propaganda to control his image. That iconic name, Dracula, comes from his father's association with the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric group devoted to defending Christendom. Dracula means son of the dragon, though later stories turned it into son of the devil. Tomato, tomato. One fringe theory. Some folklorists believe Vlad's legend fused with older Carpathian vampire myths long before Bram Stoker ever heard the name. In these hills, people whispered about blood-drinking spirits long before Dracula became a literary icon. Vlad's enemies, mostly Saxon merchants, helped spread gruesome tales across Europe. Was he really drinking blood? Probably not, but a little theatrical myth-making never hurts when you're trying to terrify your enemies and get remembered forever. You pass a stone chapel long abandoned. Inside, candles flicker, despite no visible flame. Your mind plays tricks here. Vlad's final years were filled with betrayal. After briefly aligning with Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, he was arrested and imprisoned for over a decade. Yes, imprisoned. There are records suggesting he passed his time by impaling mice and birds with tiny splinters. Hobby or red flag? You decide. When he's finally released and retakes Wallachia, he only rules for a short while before being ambushed and killed. His body is reportedly buried at the Snagov Monastery, though no confirmed remains have ever been found. And just for added spice, when archaeologists opened his supposed tomb in the 20th century, it was empty. Classic Dracula move. The torch in your hand flickers low. You hear wolves in the distance, real ones, not metaphors. The forest feels alive with stories. You think of Vlad standing alone on a fortress balcony, hair slicked back, eyes dark and unfathomable, staring down at the world he could never truly tame. And you wonder, was he evil, misunderstood, or simply a ruler who reflected the horrors of his time a little too clearly? A Romanian peasant once said of Vlad, "He was cruel, but he was ours." There's pride in that. A strange comfort. Justice, after all, is relative. In a land teetering on chaos, maybe fear was the only stable currency. You wrap your cloak tighter and move on, stepping softly as you leave behind forests that still whisper his name when the wind moves just right. As you disappear into the trees, you can't help but feel a strange sense of calm. After all, if you made it through Vlad's Wallachia, the rest of medieval Europe might feel like a lullaby. You cross the Alps under a dull gray sky. The air colder, thinner, and somehow heavier. The mountains echo with a silence that doesn't feel natural. It's the kind of silence that holds a secret. You're stepping into 13th century northern Italy, into a land of city-states, merchant dynasties, and brutal ambition. Ahead lies the fortress town of Verona, and at the center of its twisted web of violence and fear waits one of the most vicious rulers Europe has ever known, Ezzelino da Romano. The name doesn't come up in most textbooks, and yet here in Italy, it's spoken with the same reverence and fear as Attila or Caligula. You pass weathered stone arches and old Roman ruins overtaken by vines, and locals still whisper tales about Ezzelino, the son of the devil. Dramatic maybe, but wait until you hear what he did. You slip through the iron gates of his castle, and the temperature seems to drop another degree. The stone halls are darker than they should be, even with torches lit. The scent of damp limestone, stale blood, and old incense clings to the walls like a memory. You walk through boots, tapping softly, and realize you're stepping on stones that once ran slick with blood. He didn't just rule by force, he ruled by terror, and not the poetic kind. The cold, clinical kind. Born in 1194, Ezzelino, was a Gibelin, aligned with the Holy Roman Emperor, in the eternal squabble with the Pope. Italy at this point isn't a country, but a jigsaw of rival cities, each with its own militia vendettas and scheming nobles. Ezzelino was supposed to be just another warlord, the kind that came and went like storms. But instead, he built a reputation as a sadistic tyrant who seemed to actually enjoy the suffering of others. As you make your way down to the dungeons, you feel it the faint throb of the past. This is where Ezzelino imprisoned his enemies. Not for a night or a week, but sometimes for years. Entire families. Men, women, and children, locked away in pitch-black cells. Some died of starvation, others disease. The ones who lived long enough often begged not to. Historians have found records, letters written by survivors describing unimaginable horror, fingers, smashed teeth, removed food, thrown just out of reach for entertainment. And here's a fringe tidbit. Dante Alighieri. Yes, that Dante put Ezzelino in the 7th circle of hell in the inferno. That's the one reserved for the violent against others. He's knee-deep in boiling blood alongside other warlords. And honestly, it still feels generous. You emerge into the grand hall of Verona's government palace, Ezzelino's power base. It's silent now, but once it buzzed with fear. The frescoes are faded, but you can still see depictions of grim-faced knights and dark-eyed rulers. This is where he conducted public trials, which were less about justice and more about performance. He'd let victims confess crimes they never committed just to create spectacle. One prisoner supposedly confessed to stealing shadows from the emperor's soul. No one really knows what that means, but the crowd cheered anyway. Ezzelino liked a show. You step onto the balcony overlooking the city. It's dawn. The sun casts long golden beams over tiled rooftops and bell towers. It's easy to forget how beautiful this part of Italy is. But Ezzelino didn't forget. He just didn't care. If a city rebelled even slightly, he burned entire neighborhoods. Brescia, Padua, Vicenza. One account says he slaughtered 11,000 people in just a few days. Even Genghis Khan would have blinked at that number. Scientists still argue whether Ezzelino was clinically psychopathic. There's no diagnosis in the medieval sense, of course, but descriptions of his behavior line up eerily with modern assessments: lack of empathy, manipulativeness, strategic violence, and even charm. Yes, people close to him described him as captivating when he wanted to be. The kind of man who could persuade a bishop to support him one day, then burn his monastery down the next. And yet he was effective. Under his rule, trade routes stayed open. Roads were repaired. Laws were enforced with brutal consistency. It's the same paradox we've seen before tyranny that brings a twisted form of order. Even Machiavelli, writing centuries later, hinted at this dynamic: better to be feared than loved, so long as fear doesn't breed hate. Ezzelino. He skipped that last part. He welcomed the hate. A mainstream scientific fact: for context, consistent exposure to high stress and threat changes amygdala activity and hippocampal volume, especially in children. Entire generations raised under Ezzelino's rule likely experienced this kind of developmental trauma, something we now understand as having long-term impacts on emotional regulation and memory. So yes, the fear he instilled didn't just end with death. It echoed into the brains of survivors and descendants. You step into the chapel, the place he rarely visited, but always kept lavishly adorned. Gilded icons, silver candelabras, a thick velvet carpet underfoot. Ezzolino claimed to serve God. Of course he did. All tyrants think they have divine approval, but you get the feeling he liked the pageantry more than the prayer. Now, the quirky bit. According to a 14th century chronicler, Ezzolino never smiled not once. Not at jokes, not at weddings, not even at executions. His face, they said, was like stone. And when he died wounded in battle, captured and refused medical aid, his last words were a curse. He told his captors their city would crumble within a century. Weirdly, it kind of did. Coincidence or curse? You decide. You descend a spiral staircase to the armory. Weapons still hang here, rusted now forgotten. A halberd with a cracked handle. A helmet that looks like it was meant for someone with no neck. You lift a sword and feel its weight, wondering how many decisions, how many lives were balanced on such an edge. And then you hear the bells, church bells echoing across the hills, signaling the morning hour. Verona wakes up. Tourists snap photos of Juliet's balcony. Street vendors open carts filled with cannoli and espresso. No one mentions Ezzolino, but he's still here, in the bones of buildings, in the echo of silent archways, in the way certain stones refuse to stay clean. You cross a small bridge where his guards once lined up prisoners. The water beneath flows gently now. Fish dart between rocks, completely unaware of the blood once spilled above them. And you realize history forgets faces, but it never forgets fear. Ezzolino da Romano, a man too cruel for fiction, too real for comfort. You leave Verona quietly, your footsteps soft on the ancient road, as though you're trying not to disturb a ghost who never really slept. You trade Verona's crumbling shadows for the dry heat of Castile. The Spanish sun rises slowly over a land of stark mountains and golden plains where dusty olive groves stretch into the haze. You're in 14th century Spain. And ahead of you, in a palace, with rose-tinted stone and echoing courtyards, sits King Pedro I of Castile, a man so infamous he earned not one but two opposing nicknames, Pedro the Cruel and Pedro the Just. You enter his world like a ghost, trailing behind a man who is at all times either passionately in love or plotting a vendetta. His life is a fever dream of betrayals, romances, and blood-soaked retribution. And you get the impression that if Pedro weren't king, he would have made an excellent character in a soap opera or a particularly messy Shakespearean tragedy. Born in 1334, Pedro inherits the Castilian throne as a teenager. From the moment he dons the crown, everything feels tense. You walk through a candlelit corridor in the Alcazar of Seville, its delicate arches whispering Moorish influence, its cool tiles glazed with the ghosts of 1,000 secrets, and you know you're not alone. Whispers follow you. His court is packed with spies. No one is ever quite sure who's loyal, and Pedro himself likes it that way. To understand Pedro, you have to understand his obsession with Doña Maria de Padilla, his mistress confidant, and arguably the only person he ever truly trusted. You stand silently in her former chambers, where the air is still perfumed with rose oil and sorrow. Pedro married her secretly before being forced into a political marriage with Blanche of Bourbon, a French noblewoman. And what did Pedro do? He abandoned Blanche 3 days after the wedding and locked her in a tower for years. That sets the tone. A fringe theory holds that Blanche was pregnant, though historians are divided. Some say Pedro was punishing her for allegedly conspiring with his enemies. Others say he simply couldn't bear to be away from Maria. Either way, it's not a great honeymoon story. Blanche eventually died, possibly murdered. The exact cause, still debated, but suspicion hangs around Pedro like incense in a cathedral, thick, fragrant, and suffocating. You pass the throne room now, where Pedro once stood before nobles whose hands were as calloused from sword hilts as they were from betrayal. Unlike other kings who preferred political diplomacy, Pedro had a favorite negotiation tool: assassination. One account describes him personally killing a noble with a dagger at a formal dinner. Just stood up mid-conversation and stabbed him through the chest. That kind of energy doesn't win long-term loyalty. A mainstream scientific fact worth dropping: oxytocin, the so-called trust hormone, is key to forming social bonds. But in individuals with trauma or early social disruption, it can misfire, creating paranoia instead. Some modern historians argue Pedro's erratic behavior suggests a mind shaped by emotional volatility, possibly from losing his mother early and growing up amidst court conspiracy. But it wasn't all chaos. Pedro was deeply invested in justice, at least in his own way. He enforced laws with surprising fairness when it came to commoners. You stroll through an old market square where peasants once praised him for cracking down on corrupt tax collectors and greedy nobles. He didn't hesitate to execute officials caught abusing their power. Some people actually loved him for it. Others feared him even more. And then there's his relationship with the Jewish population. In an era when persecution was rampant, Pedro protected Jewish communities, offering them roles in administration and sheltering them from anti-Semitic mobs. It wasn't charity. Pedro valued their administrative talents and financial skills, but it was rare and dangerous. His enemies, especially his half-brother Henry of Trastamara, used this as propaganda to brand him as a tyrant and heretic. You pass into a chapel quiet and hollow. This is where Pedro once kept the body of Maria de Padilla after she died, still calling her his true queen. He ordered that she be buried in a royal tomb, as if to rewrite history and prove that love could override royal politics, even if only after death. A fringe tidbit: he had her reburied twice, upgrading her resting place, like someone editing a love letter over and over again, unable to let go. But you can't linger in love forever. War looms. Pedro's half-brother Henry rises in rebellion, supported by French troops and an ambitious papacy. Civil war explodes across Castile. You ride alongside Pedro's forces in the dust of La Mancha, hearing the clash of steel and the thunder of horses across sun-baked plains. He fights fiercely, but fate isn't on his side. The final scene plays out in a tent. Pedro seeks sanctuary with the Black Prince Edward of Woodstock, son of the English king. It's tense awkward. The English support Pedro for a while, but eventually the money runs out. The alliances weaken, and in 1369, at the Battle of Montiel, Pedro is betrayed, lured into a meeting with Henry, supposedly for peace talks. Instead, in the flickering firelight of a cramped tent, the two brothers brawl like beasts grappling with daggers. Henry stabs Pedro. Once, then again. Pedro bleeds out on the floor. No poetic death. No grand speech. Just the end of a life defined by passion and paranoia. You see the blood soaking into the dirt and feel the heat of the fire as Henry takes the crown, declaring himself King Henry II. Scientists still argue whether Pedro's rule should be remembered for its justice or its cruelty. Was he a reformer undone by temperament, or a tyrant with occasional moments of virtue? He remains to this day one of Spain's most polarizing historical figures. His legacy is flexible. You walk through the ruins of his palace in Carmona, arches, crumbling birds nesting where courtiers once stood. The wind whispers through broken tiles, carrying voices you can't quite understand. And you realize Pedro didn't rule with an iron fist. He ruled with a heart on fire and a dagger in each hand. He loved as fiercely as he punished, and he never did anything halfway. As you leave Castile, the sun sets in streaks of deep crimson. Maybe it's just the color of the sky, or maybe it's the echo of a king whose reign was written not in ink or stone, but in blood, longing, and everything that comes with ruling from the edge of madness. You step away from Spain's scorched fields and into the icy breath of the Russian north. The sky is a cold sheet of gray, and the earth under your feet crunches with a layer of frost, even though it's not yet deep winter. You've arrived in 16th century Russia, trudging toward the red walls and onion-domed towers of Moscow, where inside the Kremlin waits a man whose very name became shorthand for tyranny, Ivan IV Vasilievich, known to the world as Ivan the Terrible. You pass through stone archways, the smell of smoke and iron thick in the air. The streets are tense. People lower their eyes. No one speaks above a whisper. You get the feeling that words here have weight, dangerous weight, and even silence might be punishable. Inside the palace, echoes linger in long marble corridors, as if the walls remember everything. And Ivan, he remembers even more. Ivan didn't just inherit a kingdom, he inherited chaos. When he was 3, his father died. By the time he was 8, his mother had been poisoned allegedly. After that, young Ivan was raised by aristocrats, or boyars, who abused and manipulated him for years. You picture a small, sharp-eyed boy pacing the drafty halls, learning that power isn't given, it's taken. And take it he did. In 1547, at age 16, Ivan crowned himself not just Grand Prince of Moscow, but Tsar of all Rus. That's right, Tsar from the Roman Caesar. He was the first to use the title. You stand beside the golden throne as the crown is lowered onto his head. Bells ring out. Incense clouds the air. And Ivan, tall, severe eyes piercing even through ceremony, marks the beginning of something new, an empire born of ambition and paranoia. Mainstream scientific fact: childhood trauma, especially prolonged and unpredictable abuse, increases the likelihood of complex PTSD, which can manifest in paranoia, violent outbursts, and emotional dysregulation. Ivan's adult behavior fits the profile like a too-tight boot. And this wasn't a man with a therapist, he had priests and spies. You walk with him through the great halls, where his early reign was almost hopeful. He established laws, reformed the military, even created Russia's first printing press. Things could have gone another way. For a few years, he was, dare we say it, decent. But peace for Ivan was like a candle in the wind. Too soft, too brief. It all began to shift in the 1560s. First, his beloved wife Anastasia died. He suspected poison, and suddenly, the flame of his paranoia roared to life. He created the Oprichnina, a state within the state, complete with his own private army of black-robed, dog-headed enforcers who rode black horses and carried severed dog heads as a warning. You can almost hear their hoofbeats in the night, smell the leather and fear. They became the Tsar's wrath made flesh. A fringe tidbit. The Oprichniki allegedly wore black to symbolize monastic purity, like they were holy executioners. And in a way, that's exactly how Ivan saw them. They carried out purges, executions, mass deportations. Entire towns like Novgorod were targeted. Thousands were slaughtered in cold, methodical horror. As you make your way to Ivan's private chapel, you see the other side of the man. He was deeply religious, terrifyingly so. Obsessed with prophecy, divine justice, and repentance. He would pray for hours barefoot, in the snow, sobbing into the icons. Then he'd sign an execution order without blinking. One priest said Ivan's faith was as real as his fury. It didn't comfort anyone. Scientists still argue whether Ivan suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy, bipolar disorder, or lead poisoning from the green glaze used on his ornate dishware. The symptoms line up: mood swings, aggression, visual hallucinations. One report from the time claims Ivan once spoke of seeing winged demons above the Kremlin walls. You walk through a narrow hall into the golden chamber where Ivan used to dine. The room is beautiful gold leaf icons, velvet tapestries, crystal goblets, but it's said he would force boyars to grovel at his feet during meals, then test their loyalty with poison rumors. He once had a feast interrupted to execute a servant for forgetting a spoon. And then, there's the moment that defines him. You step into a modest stone room bare, except for a single chair and a large painted icon of Christ. Here, in 1581, during a rage-fueled argument, Ivan struck his own son, Ivan Ivanovich, across the head with his iron-tipped staff. The blow killed him, his heir, his only truly capable son. There are many paintings of this moment, but none more haunting than the image of Ivan cradling the boy afterward, his face a mix of grief and disbelief. You sit quietly and watch that image in your mind. The man and the monster tangled in a single gesture. Mainstream history agrees that Ivan was devastated but never quite recovered. He withdrew, paranoid, grieving, alone. His final years were a slow unraveling. He sent marriage proposals to English queens, yes, including Elizabeth I, considered fleeing Russia entirely, and frequently switched between confession, and execution, like a medieval mood ring. The quirky part, Ivan was also a composer and poet. Some of his letters and verses survive, filled with flowery metaphors and spiritual anguish. Imagine Stalin writing haikus. It's that level of cognitive dissonance. You flip through one of his old psalms, ink-faded edges burnt. It's beautiful and terrifying. He died in 1584 during a chess game, just slumped over mid-move. A quiet end for a man who brought so much noise. One modern theory suggests he may have died from a stroke brought on by years of stress and arsenic exposure. Another suggests assassination. But really, after a life like that, does it matter how he left? You leave the Kremlin by a side passage, the early morning light filtering through colored glass. Outside, the cold air slaps your face awake. The towers stretch behind you, silent now, but you can still hear the whisper of Ivan's reign. His legacy, a centralized Russian state, a culture shaped by suspicion, a name that still causes a shiver. Was he truly terrible? The Russian word Grozny actually translates closer to formidable or awe-inspiring. He was that certainly, but awe doesn't always mean admiration. Sometimes it's just the sound your heart makes when it realizes what fear looks like up close. You walk into the wind, your shadow stretching across the snow-packed road. Behind you, the land of the Tsar fades, but the frost on your fingertips tells you part of him is still watching. You're walking a fine line now, one foot still in the Middle Ages, the other slipping toward antiquity. The air has changed hotter, drier with the scent of burning oil and distant citrus. You're not exactly in the medieval period anymore, but tonight's detour is too irresistible to skip. You found yourself in ancient Rome, in the final days of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, where the walls are gilded, the streets are tense, and Emperor Nero is humming to himself while the empire burns. Yes, that Nero, the one accused of fiddling as flames swallowed the eternal city. You walk through marble archways into his sprawling palace, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. It's not a palace in the sense of towers and drawbridges. It's more like an ego made out of architecture. Gold leaf everywhere, rotating dining rooms, fountains spraying rose water into artificial groves. The ceiling literally sparkles, and it's not even tacky. It's just absurd. Nero struts through the halls barefoot, wearing a sheer tunic and a laurel crown more rock star than ruler. His lips are stained with wine, and he's halfway through composing an ode to himself. You follow silently, stepping around lounging senators and perfumed slaves, wondering how this man, born into power, raised by ambition and adored by artists, could become such a walking catastrophe. Mainstream scientific fact. Nero's behavior, according to modern psychologists, displays traits of narcissistic personality disorder, paired with potential temporal lobe epilepsy, sudden mood swings, delusions of grandeur, lack of empathy, tick, tick, tick. But in his youth, people loved him. His early reign was actually decent. He cut taxes, supported the arts, banned gladiator games involving actual death. For a minute, Rome exhaled. But the cracks came fast. First, his mother, Agrippina the Younger, who helped orchestrate his rise, started asking for too much power. So naturally, he tried to have her assassinated. First attempt. A collapsing boat, She swam to shore. Second, poison. Didn't work. Third time's the charm he sent a soldier. You can still hear the blade slicing through the surf. Scientists still argue whether Nero truly ordered Rome to burn in 64 CE or was just epically unlucky. Some say he wasn't even in the city when the fire started. Others claim he started it to make room for more palace construction. What's clear, while the city was in ashes, Nero sang a song about the fall of Troy. You know for the vibe. And here's your quirky tidbit. The fiddle didn't exist yet. The myth probably comes from later historians trying to dramatize his apathy. What he likely played was the lyre, a soft harp-like instrument. Picture a man in golden robes strumming gently while chaos erupts around him. Somehow, it's worse than a fiddle. The fire lasted 6 days. 10 of Rome's 14 districts were damaged. 3 were annihilated. Refugees packed the temples and markets. Looting, disease, desperation, and Nero, he finally returned to offer aid, sort of. He opened his gardens for shelter and organized relief efforts, but then pivoted and blamed the whole disaster on an easy scapegoat, the Christians. This was the beginning of Rome's first major Christian persecution. You walk past a scorched arena where survivors whisper prayers. Some were crucified. Others were burned alive to serve as human torches at Nero's garden parties. That's not metaphor. That's how far his sense of theater went. And yet, he still had fans. Artists adored him. The lower classes appreciated his spectacle and public games. He even competed in poetry contests, rigged ones, of course, but he always won. You attend one of his performances. He reads a tragedy. It's long, 7 hours, and no one dares leave because the last guy who tried ended up with his estate mysteriously reassigned. You pass through another corridor where busts of dead philosophers line the walls, Seneca among them. Nero's former tutor. A stoic moral voice, at least for a while, until Nero forced him to commit suicide. You imagine the old man in a cold marble bath, slitting his wrists calmly as his wife weeps beside him. A man who once tried to teach virtue, undone by the student he couldn't save, a fringe theory. Some historians believe Nero's reputation was exaggerated by enemies, especially early Christian writers who wanted a convenient villain. There's even speculation he wasn't quite as monstrous as depicted, just flamboyant and politically disastrous. The problem is, when you act like a god and your empire starts to crumble, the optics get bad. Eventually, the conspiracies pile up. Even the Senate, once pliant, turns on him. A rebellion rises in Gaul. The Praetorian Guard, his elite protectors, desert him. Nero flees the city disguised as a slave hiding in a villa outside Rome. You crouch behind a crumbling pillar and watch him pacing, muttering, occasionally reciting lines from his own plays. When the soldiers arrive, Nero panics. He begs a companion to help him die. The sword enters his throat, shaking fingers guiding it. His last words. Reportedly, Qualis artifex perio. What an artist dies in me. Of course, his death marks the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and the beginning of a chaotic civil war called the Year of the Four Emperors. Rome descends into instability, but eventually rebuilds. And yet Nero's ghost lingers. Statues are torn down, names scratched from monuments, and still some in the East whispered that he wasn't really dead, that he'd return riding with an army like some apocalyptic anti-hero. You stand at the edge of the ruins, listening. There's music in the distance, a faint lyre string, maybe just the wind through an olive grove. But in your mind's eye, the empire still flickers. It smells like ash oil and overripe grapes. It glows gold and red, and somewhere in its shadow, Nero smirks, strumming softly while the world burns again. Was he truly a medieval king? Not technically, but as you've learned, cruelty, chaos, and delusion aren't bound by strict timelines. Nero may be ancient, but his spirit fits this cavalcade of terrible rulers just fine. You turn brush dust from your cloak and follow the Appian Way north. Rome fades behind you, but its stories never do. You arrive on a battlefield shrouded in fog. Morning dew clings to the brambles, and the ground is soft with mud and something else you'd rather not think about. You're in 15th century England, and history is about to take a dramatic, muddy turn. A crown lies somewhere ahead, half buried and contested as two noble houses rip the kingdom apart. This is the Wars of the Roses, and your reluctant star is King Richard III, a man remembered more for what may have been done than what was. You pass broken standards, lying in the grass, white rose, red rose, and step into a world not so much ruled by monarchs as it is twisted by rumor. Richard's story is like a hallway of warped mirrors. Every account reflects something different. Villain, martyr, tyrant, tragic king. Shakespeare painted him with a hunchback and a sneer, a snake with a crown. But how much of that is true? Let's find out quietly. There are tutors listening. You slip into the royal chambers at Middleham Castle. It's colder than expected, the walls thick and stone heavy. Richard grows up here, not yet the infamous hunchback, but a solemn, sharp child sent away from home at a young age. He's trained in warfare law and political maneuvering. There are no bedtime stories in this place, just caution duty and an awareness that every smile might come with a hidden blade. The Wars of the Roses pit the House of York, Richard's side against the House of Lancaster, his future enemies. You're in the middle of what amounts to an extended family feud with a body count. Richard's brother, Edward IV, eventually becomes king, and Richard becomes his most loyal lieutenant. You see him riding into battle, his armor gleaming, his tactics brutal but effective. He's not evil, not yet, just committed. Then things start to fall apart. Edward dies. Suddenly, leaving behind a 12-year-old heir, Edward Veto, Richard is named Lord Protector. You follow him through candlelit courtrooms and hushed strategy meetings. He's supposed to safeguard the young king until he comes of age, but within weeks, Richard locks Edward and his younger brother in the Tower of London. For their safety, he says. They're never seen again. This is where the whispering gets louder. The princes in the tower, as they'll come to be known, vanish. And while no evidence directly implicates Richard, it's hard to ignore the math. 2 potential rivals, 1 newly crowned king, 0 surviving children. Even in your quiet corner of the tower, you feel the unease. The beds are still made, the pages of their books still dog-eared, and the windows are shuttered tight against time, mainstream Scientific fact. Human memory is notoriously malleable, especially when shaped by post-event misinformation. The Tudor dynasty, which followed Richard's downfall, had every incentive to paint him as monstrous. Shakespeare's portrayal written during Elizabeth I's reign solidified this narrative for centuries, but archaeology complicates it. A quirky tidbit. In 2012, Richard III's skeleton was discovered under a parking lot in Leicester. It was buried hastily, spine clearly deformed from scoliosis. Not a monstrous hunchback, but definitely not a typical frame. He wasn't handsome. He wasn't tall, but he wasn't inhuman either. You step into the great hall where Richard takes the throne. The crown doesn't sit comfortably on his head. It seems almost borrowed. His reign is short, just 2 years, but he passes significant reforms protections for debtors, the right to bail support for printing legal statutes in English so commoners can understand them. It's not flashy, but it matters. And it makes the question murkier. How can the villain also be the reformer? Still, the crown is heavy. A rebellion brews in the south, led by Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian with a weak claim and a stronger army. You stand on the grassy slopes of Bosworth Field in 1485, the air thick with storm clouds and prophecy. Richard leads the charge himself, no hiding in tents for this king. He cries, "A horse, a horse. My kingdom for a horse." And unlike in the play, this isn't a metaphor. His horse is dead. His army is deserting. And he fights on foot, surrounded until he has cut down the last English king to die in battle. His body is stripped, slung over a horse displayed for days. But in death, Richard starts to become more than just a defeated monarch. He becomes a question. Scientists still argue whether Richard ordered the deaths of the princes or whether they were killed by someone else like the Duke of Buckingham or even Henry VII himself. No contemporary source confirms Richard's guilt, and the historical documents, they were often penned years later under Tudor eyes and Tudor pens. In the quiet cathedral in Leicester, you now stand by his final resting place. After centuries in a parking lot, Richard finally got a king's burial in 2015, complete with trumpets, Latin chants, and national debate. His tomb is sleek, dignified, and faintly apologetic. It's like the entire country is saying, "Sorry about the bad press." You sit beside the grave thinking not just of Richard, but of history's long memory. The things we accept as fact, because someone with a quill wrote them. The way a single man can be both a villain and a victim, depending on who writes the last paragraph. Was he terrible? Maybe. Was he misunderstood? Certainly. But most of all, Richard III was human flawed, fierce, and fated to be remembered through layers of other people's agendas. You rise slowly, brush the dust from your sleeves, and step back into the fog. Behind you, the ghosts of Bosworth whisper, not of crowns or blood, but of lost boys in towers and the long crooked shadows that power always leaves behind. You step off the English moors and into the green heart of Brittany, where the castles are crooked, the forests dense, and something darker than mere politics lingers in the stone. It's the 15th century again, and this time, you're not in the company of a cruel king or a scheming emperor. You're walking behind a knight once heroic, now infamous. a man who rode with Joan of Arc and ended his life in disgrace, surrounded by whispers, screams, and smoke. Gilles de Rais. The sky is a dull gray, the kind that never seems to move. You cross a wooden bridge into the looming silhouette of Chateau de Tiffauges, one of several castles Gilles owned. The gates creak open slowly, and even before you step inside, you sense it. Something is wrong here. The air feels too still. The birds don't sing. Inside the courtyard, the stones seem to exhale sorrow. Born in 1405 to one of France's wealthiest families, Gilles de Rais was a war hero. He fought alongside Joan of Arc at Orléans, lifting the siege in one of the most legendary moments of the Hundred Years' War. You see him in your mind resplendent in shining armor, a banner trailing behind him, sword raised toward heaven. He wasn't just brave, he was admired, trusted, celebrated. But something in him unraveled. After Joan's capture and execution, Gilles withdrew from public life. You step into the echoing great hall of Tiffauges, where torchlight flickers on faded tapestries and hunting trophies. His wealth was immense. He squandered it on pageantry alchemy and elaborate theatrical productions in which he always played the lead. Yes, he put on plays, sometimes hundreds of performers, extravagant costume sets painted in gold leaf. You walk past a rotting stage in the courtyard and wonder if any of them knew what was coming. Because beneath the glamour, something far more grotesque was unfolding. A mainstream scientific fact, extreme early trauma, and sudden removal from a social purpose such as warfare or national service can trigger a psychological crisis in individuals prone to dissociation or delusional thinking. Some believe Gilles experienced something like this after Joan's death, a collapse of identity, purpose, and reality. You follow a narrow passage behind the main hall, down into a chamber that feels more like a tomb than a basement. This is where the interrogators would later say the horror occurred. According to confessions, some coerced, some voluntary, Gilles de Rais lured dozens, possibly hundreds of children to his estates. He promised work or education, then they disappeared. What happened next? The records are ghastly. The children were tortured, murdered, and often rituals were performed around their remains. You shiver. The room is colder than it should be, even for stone. There's a heavy smell in your imagination, iron and old wax and wood, soaked with things better forgotten. Fringe scholars have long debated the legitimacy of the charges. Some argue the case was a fabrication orchestrated by political rivals and greedy bishops eager to seize Gilles' vast lands. After all, he was tried by both secular and ecclesiastical courts in a time when land disputes often wore religious masks. The testimonies were contradictory. Some children reappeared. Some servants may have lied under pressure. But there were also confessions from Gilles himself, detailed, strange, and terrifyingly specific. He described methods, names, rituals, tears were shed. He recanted, then admitted again. Historians still argue whether these were the words of a broken man or a guilty one. If the latter, he may be one of the earliest recorded serial killers in European history. Quirky and deeply unsettling detail. Gilles allegedly became obsessed with alchemy and demonology, attempting to summon a demon named Baron to restore his fortune. He reportedly offered the lives of children as part of the ritual. No demon showed up, of course, unless you count the one wearing Gilles' face. Back in the upper chambers, you find Gilles' chapel, ornate, faded, still pretending to be holy. He funded churches, built organs, composed religious music. The contrast is unbearable. In this same castle, both hymns and horror echoed down the halls. Eventually, word spread. A few brave families spoke out. The Bishop of Nantes launched an inquiry. By 1440, Gilles was arrested and put on trial. The court documents, still preserved, read like something between a horror novel and a surrealist play. Pages of gruesome allegations, drawn diagrams, testimonies of grieving parents, and guilt-stricken servants. You picture the court listening in stunned silence, unsure if they were witnessing a real man or a myth unraveling. Gilles was convicted, of course. You walk with him to the execution site, a field near Nantes, where he was hanged and then burned, his ashes scattered to prevent martyrdom. Some accounts say he died with dignity. Others say he wept. You wonder what went through his mind in those final moments, glory, guilt, madness. Scientists still debate whether he was delusional, deeply evil, or simply the victim of a calculated smear campaign. The psychological profile is murky. Was he trying to recreate lost battlefield adrenaline through cruelty? Was he emulating martyrdom in reverse, destroying innocence instead of defending it? As you leave Tiffauges, the wind picks up. You pass through a crumbling gatehouse. Behind you, the castle looms against the sky like a wound. Birds still don't sing. The ground is quiet. You look back once, and the windows seem to stare. Gilles de Rais, hero and horror, savior and butcher. His legacy is a study in contradictions, a medieval fever dream laced with war worship and unthinkable violence. He's the tale parents told to scare children and the man once entrusted to defend them. You walk on into the hills, the scent of pine slowly overtaking the dread in your lungs. But the story clings to you like fog, and you realize not all monsters are myths. Some wore armor, some wore velvet, and some smiled. The landscape shifts again this time to rolling hills dotted with monasteries, vineyards, and half-forgotten churches. You find yourself in Bohemia, in the heart of 14th century Central Europe, where beer flows more readily than law's books pile up in castle libraries, and a king sleeps while his kingdom crumbles. Welcome to the strange, meandering reign of Wenceslas IV of Bohemia, a monarch whose legacy is less about tyranny and more about lethargy, mismanagement, and ill-timed naps. The cobblestones in Prague are slick from last night's rain, and as you walk through Old Town's twisting streets, the scent of hops and damp parchment clings to your cloak. This was once a place of learning, energy, religious debate, until Wenceslas decided to let it all sort of go. You duck under a stone archway leading into Prague Castle, and even before stepping inside, you sense the unease, not terror, but disappointment. A kind of national sigh. Wenceslas is the son of Charles IV, one of the greatest Holy Roman emperors. Charles built universities, fostered the arts, united lands. Wenceslas mostly didn't. You walk through the palace's reception hall, once a glittering court of scholars and diplomats, now echoing with the clink of tankards and the snores of officials waiting for meetings that never happen. He ascended to the Bohemian throne in 1378 and was elected king of the Romans the same year. On paper, He had everything: education, legitimacy, powerful allies. But Wenceslaus had a fatal flaw. He hated governing. He liked hunting. He liked drinking. He liked reading weird theology. He did not like answering letters, listening to advisors, or attending coronations, especially his own. A quirky tidbit: Wenceslaus refused to attend his own imperial coronation in Rome. The Holy Roman Empire needed him to show up, put on the crown, wave to the bishops. He just didn't. Skipped the whole thing, too tired, or hung over, or lost interest halfway to Italy. No one really knows. As you wander his library, dust motes dance in the sunlight streaming through stained glass. Wenceslaus did love books. He funded the copying of countless manuscripts, religious texts, herbal guides, alchemical theories. Some of them still survive, filled with illustrations of winged beasts and tiny golden plants no one's seen since. You run your finger along the spine of one. It smells like beeswax and lavender. So maybe he wasn't cruel, just distracted. Eternally. Mainstream scientific fact: chronic alcohol use, especially from a young age, shrinks the prefrontal cortex, impairing decision-making and executive function. Scholars speculate Wenceslaus may have suffered long-term effects from heavy drinking combined with clinical depression, which his contemporaries described with vague terms like melancholy and dark humors. And dark things were stirring. The church was fracturing. The Western Schism saw 2, sometimes 3 popes claiming authority. Wenceslaus tried to stay neutral, tried to unify the factions, but he lacked the charisma or discipline to lead through crisis. You join a council meeting in a high tower chamber, bishops arguing, nobles fuming, and Wenceslaus quietly dozing in the corner chair. A dog at his feet, a goblet of mead in his lap. His eyes flutter open occasionally, but he adds nothing. The meeting dissolves into frustrated silence. Then there was Jan Hus, the preacher and proto-reformer, whose sermons in Prague called out corruption and demanded spiritual reform. You sneak into the back of Bethlehem Chapel and hear him preach, his voice calm but fiery. The crowd leans in. Wenceslaus. He's indifferent. He likes Hus personally, but makes no effort to protect him from church condemnation. Eventually, Hus is arrested and burned at the stake. You hear the crackling flames echo through the streets. The people are furious. The king is asleep. A fringe theory. Some modern Czech scholars argue Wenceslaus had undiagnosed epilepsy, citing episodes of sudden fainting confusion and erratic behavior. Others point to possible mercury exposure used in alchemy and medicine at the time as a cause of his deteriorating mental state. But the nobles don't care about his diagnosis. They care that roads aren't being built, taxes aren't being collected, and foreign threats go unchallenged. Several times he's kidnapped by disgruntled aristocrats. Not once, 3 times. Imagine being so bad at your job, your coworkers literally lock you in a tower until you agree to do better. You step into that tower, now high above the Vltava River. It's quiet, drafty. Scratched initials mark the window ledge. Wenceslaus sat here for weeks at a time, staring out over Prague, sipping wine, ignoring petitions. When released, he often resumed the same old habits. The nobility gave up hope. Eventually, his brother Sigismund, who had actual ambition, decided enough was enough. He arranged to have Wenceslaus deposed as king of the Romans. In 1400, the title was taken from him. The empire moved on. Bohemia didn't. Wenceslas stayed king there until his death, though more in name than in action. Toward the end of his life, he wandered the castle gardens at night, muttering to himself surrounded by dogs. He barely held court, rarely bathed, lived almost like a ghost in his own palace. When he died in 1419, it wasn't with fanfare or ceremony, just silence. Fitting. And yet, he's remembered. In a twist of historical irony, he became the subject of a beloved Christmas carol, Good King Wenceslas. Except that song was about Wenceslas once a completely different guy from the 10th century. Our Wenceslas wrong century wrong saint, wrong vibe entirely. Still, people mix them up. The legacy of the lazy king lives on in festive confusion. You walk through Prague's streets as dusk settles in. The city feels timeless, old stone and golden light. Wenceslas Square buzzes with life now. Trams hum past. Students laugh under neon signs. The past is layered beneath it all, like sediment. And somewhere beneath your feet, a king once chose silence over sovereignty, comfort over consequence. Was he terrible? Not in the bloody sense. He didn't massacre cities or boil his rivals, but he let apathy rot a kingdom. And in a world where neglect can do as much damage as cruelty, sometimes the absence of action is the most dangerous reign of all. You step into a quiet tavern, the fire flickering low. A glass of ale waits. Maybe you'll stay for a bit. Read an old manuscript. Drift off beside the hearth. Tonight's king wasn't evil, just tired. And somehow, that might be worse. The fog thickens again, and your feet echo softly on cobbled streets as you arrive in Tudor England, where the scent of burnt wood and wet stone fills the early morning air. You're standing in the heart of London, mid-16th century. The towers loom taller here, their spires stabbing at a gray sky. Smoke coils from chimneys, but it isn't just from hearths, it's from execution fires. And at the center of it all sits a queen whose nickname needs no embellishment, Mary I of England, better known as Bloody Mary. You enter the gates of Whitehall Palace, the residence of a monarch remembered as much for what she burned as what she tried to build. Her halls are richly decorated, filled with tapestries of saints and martyrs, stained glass windows bleeding color onto the stone floor. Everything is precise, devout, and desperately anxious. You can feel the pressure in the walls, the need to be seen as rightful, as righteous, as remembered. Mary was the daughter of King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, and from the moment she was born, her life was marked by rejection and fear. You peek into a small nursery chamber, long abandoned, where once a child was rocked under the weight of royal uncertainty when her father split from the Catholic Church to marry Anne Boleyn. Mary was declared illegitimate, stripped of her titles, and sent to live as a servant in her half-sister Elizabeth's household. Imagine that, being born a princess and then suddenly being told you're no one. So when Mary finally ascended to the throne in 1553, after the failed attempt to install Lady Jane Grey, she didn't just inherit a country. She inherited trauma, vengeance, and a church that looked nothing like the one she believed in, and she believed hard. You follow Mary into her private chapel, where candles burn even at noon. The scent of myrrh and beeswax is so strong it turns the air syrupy. She kneels in full regalia, her crown pressing against her skull, praying for the soul of England. To Mary, this isn't about politics. It's about salvation. And salvation requires fire. Mainstream scientific fact. When someone grows up in prolonged emotional stress, especially with repeated rejection from parental figures, the brain's amygdala becomes hyperactive, heightening fear responses and emotional volatility. Mary's early years shaped her into a woman who saw enemies everywhere, especially among those who dared practice a faith other than hers. Within months of taking power, she reversed the English Reformation. Protestant bishops were arrested, priests fled, and the burnings began. You walk past Smithfield, where the ground itself seems to flinch under your feet. This was where many of the executions happened, public, prolonged, terrifying. The smell of singed cloth, the sound of flames licking wood, the sight of crowds pretending not to enjoy the spectacle, and above it all, Mary's unshakable belief that she was saving souls. Nearly 300 people were burned alive during her 5-year reign. You visit one of the parish churches, where names are still etched into the walls, men and women. Some barely adults, condemned not for treason, but for belief, for refusing to say Mass in Latin, for owning the wrong Bible, for questioning the wrong priest. And here's the quirky bit. Mary wasn't the worst offender in terms of numbers. Her father, Henry VIII, executed more than 50,000 during his reign. But Mary's executions were intensely personal, often focused on symbolic targets, respected preachers, high-profile thinkers. It wasn't the number of deaths, it was the manner. The deliberate public purification. You step into a small room off the royal garden where Mary once hosted ambassadors. The tapestries are dark crimson, stitched with lilies and blood. Here she met Philip II of Spain, her husband. Their marriage was meant to unite Catholic Europe and produce an heir to secure England's Catholic future. It produced nothing but disappointment. Philip rarely visited. Mary suffered multiple phantom pregnancies, her stomach swelling, her breasts aching, even morning sickness, but no child ever came. Some believe it was hormonal imbalance. Others say psychosomatic hysteria, born of obsession and hope. Scientists still argue whether Mary suffered from a pituitary tumor, ovarian cysts, or simply intense psychological stress manifesting physically. Medical records are vague, but her personal letters reveal confusion, despair, and a body that seemed to betray her as deeply as her people did. You follow her through Hampton Court Palace, where she once waited with hand on belly, convinced a child would arrive. When the birth never came, the silence was louder than cannon fire. Courtiers whispered, Elizabeth waited in the wings, and Mary began to fade. Her popularity plummeted. She lost Calais, England's last continental possession, a blow to national pride. Her court grew quiet, her servants cautious. Even her devout supporters started muttering. But Mary never backed down. She believed to the very end that her soul and her country's depended on complete obedience to the true church. She died in 1558 at age 42. The land didn't mourn. The bells rang half-heartedly, and within days Elizabeth I ascended swiftly, reversing Mary's religious policies. The fires went out, the altars changed, and Mary's legacy, already fragile, turned to ash. And yet, you pause outside the Tower of London where Mary once rode as both prisoner and queen. It's raining softly now, the kind of drizzle that seeps into your bones. Was she a tyrant? Yes, but she was also a woman, crushed between the weight of her father's legacy, her faith, and a body that refused to grant her the one thing she needed most, a child to justify it all. You pass a statue of her, often ignored by tourists, the inscription, weathered and plain. She looks tired, human, haunted, not by ghosts, but by the choices she thought were holy. History remembered her for the flames, but maybe in the quiet, she should also be remembered for the desperation. For the woman who truly believed she could heal a kingdom by purging it. And maybe, just maybe, for the fear that if she failed, her own soul would be next. You cross the Thames under a silver sky, the sound of bells in the distance. Somewhere, another monarch waits. But for now, you remember Mary's London, the smell of fire, the echo of prayer, and a woman who ruled with conviction sharper than any sword. The cold stiffens again, but this time it's not English drizzle or bohemian melancholy. It's a knife-edge Scandinavian wind whistling over gray seas and stone ramparts. You're in early 16th century Stockholm, where the blood doesn't just flow, metaphorically. It literally paints the cobblestones. Welcome to the reign of Christian II of Denmark, a man whose crown came with thorns, whose ideas were ahead of their time, and whose decisions cost hundreds their lives. You arrive as the city prepares for what should be a celebration. Christian has just conquered Sweden in 1520, ending years of resistance and civil strife. As King of Denmark and Norway, he now claims the Swedish crown, as well finally reuniting the Kalmar Union, a centuries-old Nordic alliance, long torn by factional rivalries. You walk into a grand courtyard lined with banners and pavilions. There's music, feasting, dancing. It all feels like the beginning of a golden age. It isn't. Christian's coronation is a theatrical success. Nobles raise their cups. Church bells toll across Stockholm. A few drops of wine spill here and there, red on stone. You pause to note that the stains look suspiciously like foreshadowing. The very next morning, the mood shifts. The king's guards, freshly armored and distinctly not smiling, begin arresting guests. At first, just a few, then dozens. Clergy, nobles, scholars, many of whom had supported Christian's crowning just days before. They're charged with heresy for allegedly opposing the Catholic Church. Heresy in this case is a convenient label for political resistance. You find yourself in the city square on November 8, 1520. The sky is overcast. The air smells of wet wool and fear. And the executions begin. One by one, nobles are dragged before the crowd. Some kneel, some scream, some pray, some are beheaded, others are hanged. Some, it's said, were buried alive. This is the Stockholm bloodbath. In 3 days, over 80 people are executed, perhaps more. Christian watches from a balcony, his face unreadable. To him, it's not cruelty, it's purification. Removing weeds so something new can grow. Mainstream scientific fact. This kind of psychological distancing where leaders rationalize brutality as a necessary cleansing is tied to cognitive dissonance. When individuals feel morally conflicted, the brain often reinterprets events to align actions with ideology. Christian likely believed he was saving the Union even as the blood soaked his boots. But the backlash is immediate. You walk through streets where doors are shuttered, children hidden. Sweden doesn't weep, it roars. A resistance leader named Gustav Vasa escapes the massacre and begins gathering support. Within 3 years, Sweden has revolted, driven out Danish forces, and declared independence. The Kalmar Union shatters, and Christian his problems are only beginning. You follow him back to Denmark, where he tries to modernize the kingdom. Here's where things get complicated. Because Christian, for all his violence, had progressive ideas, he imposed laws to protect peasants from nobles, allowed serfs to buy freedom, and cracked down on corrupt landowners. He even encouraged Dutch immigrants to bring new farming methods, draining swamps and turning wasteland into fertile land. A quirky little tidbit. He invited Dutch cheesemakers to Denmark to teach the locals better dairy techniques. So yes, among all the murder and mayhem, you can thank Christian II for introducing improved cheese production to Scandinavia. But progressive reform makes enemies too. The Danish nobility doesn't like being told to play nice with peasants. The clergy resents the crown's encroachment, and whispers spread. Christian's foreign-born advisors are blamed for the bloodbath. His Queen Isabella of Austria is respected. But his mistress Divike, a commoner, is scandalous. Her mother Sigbrit becomes an influential economic advisor, a woman in power, which makes things even worse in noble eyes. Scientists still argue whether Christian was a visionary monarch ahead of his time or simply a man whose political idealism lacked the finesse and empathy to succeed. His reforms were remarkable. His delivery, catastrophic. You follow him into exile. Yes, by 1523, the Danish nobles force him to abdicate. He flees to the Netherlands under the protection of the Habsburgs. But he's not done. Christian tries to return to reclaim his throne, sailing with a small fleet in 1531. It fails. He's captured, imprisoned by his uncle, and locked in Sonderborg Castle for the next 17 years. You walk through the halls of that fortress, damp, dim, the smell of salt water and mildew curling through narrow corridors. Christian is kept in relative comfort. At first, books, servants, letters. But as years pass, conditions worsen. Eventually, he's confined to a single room with a hole in the door for food like an animal. And here's where the legend kicks in. There's a long-standing myth that Christian paced the same narrow path across his cell floor so endlessly that his footsteps wore a groove into the stone. You step into the room and look down, and yes, there it is, a faint hollow line circling like a ghost of his patience. It's debated whether the mark is authentic, but either way, the symbolism is too rich to ignore. He was released in 1549, after nearly 2 decades. He died 3 years later, largely forgotten his reign, remembered only for one brutal week in Stockholm and a handful of half-finished reforms. But there's a twist to his legacy. In Denmark, he's mostly remembered not as a tyrant, but as a tragic reformer. Some even call him Christian the Good. In Sweden, he's a national villain, a tyrant. the man whose bloodbath gave birth to modern Swedish independence. 2 countries, 1 king. 2 completely different stories. And that's the legacy of Christian II, a man who dreamed of a united Scandinavia, who tried to remake society from the top down, and whose crown cracked under the weight of both idealism and fear. A king who killed to save unity, only to scatter the pieces permanently. You walk the waterfront in Stockholm, where a soft snow has begun to fall. Tourists buy cinnamon buns. Children toss bread to seagulls. And below their feet, the cobblestones still remember. You move south now, away from frozen gulfs and smoky gallows, into a realm of tangled forests, watchful towers and halls thick with whispers. This is 15th century France, but not the glamorous, romantic France of Renaissance paintings. No. You've stepped into the spider's web, the court of Louis XI, known widely and somewhat unsettlingly as the Spider King. The breeze here is softer, the trees full of rustling leaves that seem to eavesdrop as you walk. In the distance, the bells of Amboise Castle chime through the Loire Valley, but the pleasant sound doesn't fool you. Louis XI is waiting, and he doesn't like surprises. You enter the castle's inner courtyard quiet, except for the flick of pigeons and the low murmur of scribes hunched over desks. There's no music, no court jesters, no laughing nobles, just clerks' informants, and maps, so many maps, because Louis doesn't rule with swords. He rules with paperwork, and secrets, and fear. He ascended to the throne in 1461, inheriting a France still licking its wounds from the 100 Years' War. Other kings might have gone for parades, reforms, or marriage alliances. Louis, he built a spy network so vast it made every noble paranoid to speak above a whisper. You can almost hear it, the shuffle of letters changing hands in alleyways, the quiet click of coded messages tucked behind chapel walls. Mainstream scientific fact. The brain's dopaminergic system fuels obsession with control and pattern recognition traits often seen in both visionaries and paranoiacs. Louis exhibited both. His need to know everything, to control every thread of the kingdom's web, defined his entire reign. That, and his complete lack of interest in traditional kingliness. You find him not in royal robes, but in a simple gray wool tunic, pacing in his study. His boots are dusty. His beard is unkempt. He wears a soft felt hat pulled low. No crown, no flourish. He looks more like a merchant than a monarch. That was on purpose. He liked to be underestimated. He didn't trust anyone, not his nobles, not his family, not his own advisors. You walk past the scribe's desk and glimpse sealed letters written in his own hand. Orders bypassing entire councils. He preferred working alone or through men he could discard. And when he did use people, he used them until they broke. One man, Jacques Coeur, a brilliant financier who helped build France's treasury, fell afoul of court politics. Louis stripped him of his fortune and exiled him. Another, Charles the Bold of Burgundy, was once an ally. Louis flattered him, manipulated him, then waited for him to self-destruct in war. When Charles died in battle, Louis scooped up Burgundy like a cat slurping spilled cream. Quirky tidbit, Louis was so obsessed with astrology and superstition that he carried relics of saints sewn into his clothing just in case. He surrounded himself with astrologers and monks, and even kept a personal collection of lucky relics, including the supposed teeth of saints. No one dared laugh. But here's the darker side. Louis XI made fear his policy. He created the lettres de cachet royal orders that allowed him to imprison anyone anywhere without trial. Entire families vanished into stone towers with no explanation. One such prison was Plessis-les-Tours, a grim fortress where iron cages hung from the walls. Inside them, nobles, officials, and anyone who annoyed the king. Legend says some cages were so small the prisoners couldn't sit or stand properly, just crouch forever. You step into the dark stone hallway of Plessis, now your boots crunching over straw. The air is thick with mildew and rust. Somewhere, a drop of water echoes like a clock counting down someone's sentence. These weren't dungeons of madness, like under Ezzelino or Vlad. They were clinical silent. No screams, just slow, precise decay. Scientists still argue whether Louis XI's spy state was proto-modern or just the last gasp of medieval paranoia. Some call him the first bureaucratic monarch. Others call him a control freak with delusions of sainthood. But it worked. He weakened the nobility, strengthened royal authority, and centralized the French government, laying groundwork for future absolute monarchs like Louis XIV. And yet, he was deeply isolated. You see him in his final years, rarely leaving his study, surrounded by priests and leeches. Literally, he relied heavily on bloodletting and pilgrimages to cure ailments. He built Notre Dame de Cléry as both a church and his own tomb. But he didn't build a grand mausoleum. He wanted something modest, hidden, like he didn't trust even death to leave him in peace. You walk through the church now, past quiet candles and a cold stone floor. His tomb lies beneath a plain slab. No golden sarcophagus, no soaring monument. Just a few worn inscriptions and the faint scent of old incense. The Spider King, who spun a kingdom into compliance, left almost no physical legacy. His web vanished the moment he died, but not entirely. His reforms outlived him. His methods fear intelligence, pragmatism became a blueprint for future rulers across Europe. Machiavelli, writing a generation later, practically channeled Louis when describing how to maintain power. Rule with mercy when it works. Rule with terror when it doesn't. You step into the courtyard once more, and the wind feels sharper. No monuments rise to Louis XI. Tourists skip his name. But in the quiet, if you look closely, you'll see his handprint in the rules that govern nations, in the ink of bureaucratic memos, in the locked drawers of intelligence agencies. He didn't conquer by the sword. He conquered by knowing everything, by waiting, by watching. As the castle fades into twilight, you look back one last time. The windows are dark. The pigeon coos are gone. But somewhere inside, the Spider King is still spinning. The corridors are wider now, brighter, opulent. You've left behind the narrow towers and drafty chapels of obscure tyrants and slipped into a palace of velvet carpets, stained glass windows, and roast meat wafting through the gulf air. You're in Tudor England again. But this time, it's not fog and firelight. It's grandeur and ego. And waiting at the end of the hall, feet spread, beard glistening with oil, and belt straining for dear life, is none other than King Henry VIII. This isn't just a king, this is a brand. You hear his name and immediately think wives' beheadings, palaces break with Rome, turkey legs, and increasingly tight pants. But tonight, you're not just gawking at a wax figure in a museum. You're following Henry through the gleaming halls of Hampton Court Palace, listening for the things not told in textbooks, the echoes, the creaks, the contradictions of a man who changed England forever, mostly because he couldn't get what he wanted. He was born in 1491, the golden second son, not meant to be king. That job was his brother Arthur's, until Arthur dropped dead after marrying Catherine of Aragon. Enter Henry, fresh-faced and muscular, who steps into power at 17 and marries his brother's widow. At first, he's charismatic, athletic, musical, a true Renaissance prince. You glimpse him practicing archery on the palace lawn, sunlight catching the golden trim of his jerkin. He's laughing. He's winning. For a moment, it seems England is in good hands. But then comes the pressure to produce a male heir. You walk beside Catherine, quiet and regal, in corridors lined with tapestries she helped design. She gives birth multiple times. Only one child survives, Mary, the future Bloody Mary. No son. Henry grows restless. And when Anne Boleyn arrives, sharp-witted, fashionable, mysterious, the storm truly begins. Mainstream scientific fact. Obsessive fixation, particularly when paired with unchecked power, alters brain chemistry in ways similar to addiction. Henry's desperation for a male heir may have triggered this cycle: hope, disappointment, blame, repeat. It drove him to rewrite not only his marriage but his country's religion. He petitions the Pope for an annulment. The Pope waffles. Henry waits, then snaps. He declares himself head of the Church of England, effectively launching the English Reformation. Monasteries are dissolved, churches looted, relics smashed. You stand in a dusty cloister as monks are escorted out under armed guard. Gold chalices melted, libraries burned. The old world ends not with fire, but with paperwork and politics. And Anne. She gets her crown, her lavish coronation, and a daughter, Elizabeth. No son. Henry's disappointment turns to suspicion. She's accused of adultery, incest, and treason. You slip into the Tower of London as her final prayers echo off cold stone. She's beheaded by a French swordsman chosen for his finesse. He moves on quickly. Jane Seymour gives him a son. Edward then dies. Henry mourns, but not for long. Next comes Anne of Cleves, divorced. Catherine Howard beheaded. Catherine Parr outlives him. The rhyme is famous: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. You recite it silently as you walk the candlelit gallery. Quirky tidbit: Henry composed music. There's a surviving piece called Pastime with Good Company. It's jaunty, catchy, and suspiciously upbeat for a man who had 2 wives executed. But that's the thing with Henry. He's performing the role of the perfect king even as his country trembles under the weight of his whims. You pass the kitchens where the scent of roasting fowl and spiced wine clings to the air. Henry liked to eat lavishly. By midlife, he's no longer the dashing knight. He suffers from leg ulcers, chronic festering, and painful. The once athletic king now has to be lifted with a pulley system onto his horse. The transformation is shocking. You glance at a portrait, slim Henry on the left, bloated Henry on the right. It's like watching time get personal. Scientists still argue whether he suffered from Cushing's syndrome, type 2 diabetes, or the after effects of a traumatic head injury during a jousting accident in 1536. That injury knocked him unconscious for 2 hours. Afterward, contemporaries noted increased paranoia, impulsivity, and explosive temper. As you follow him into the council chamber, the tone changes. He's grown increasingly isolated. His inner circle shrinks. Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, Anne Boleyn, Thomas Wolsey, all once trusted, all discarded or executed. You can hear the creak of the chair as Henry leans back now, deeply suspicious of even his closest advisors. Yet even in his worst moments, he remains a master politician. He maneuvers the nation through shifting alliances, wars with France and Scotland, and domestic upheaval. His reforms laid foundations, some broken, some enduring. The Anglican Church, the Navy, the idea that a king could override even Rome. But there's a cost. The people grow tired. You walk through fields where monasteries once stood, now rubble. Peasants whisper of lost relics, empty bell towers and coins, with the king's face but none of his promises, and yet they still feared and obeyed him because Henry wasn't just a man anymore. He had become the state. Toward the end of his life, you find him in Whitehall Palace, bloated, groaning, surrounded by doctors, applying leeches and honey poultices. The air smells of blood, sweat, and rot. He signs documents with shaking hands. His son Edward is just a child. The future is fragile. He dies in 1547 at the age of 55. His coffin reportedly exploded due to poor embalming. Some say his body leaked onto the floor of St. George's Chapel. You step quietly past his tomb, where he lies beside Jane Seymour, the only wife he claimed to love. Tourists come for the drama. 6 wives, a reformation, a golden age that followed. But you tonight saw the man behind the stories. A ruler who mixed vision with vanity, mercy with monstrosity, faith with fury. Henry VIII wasn't just terrible. He was terribly human, ambitious, afraid, hungry, obsessed with legacy. And in the end, that legacy was real. His daughter, Elizabeth, would rule for 45 years. His name would echo through centuries, and his face, painted regal, almost defiant, still stares out from textbooks and museum walls. You step back into the night. The palace behind you flickers in torchlight, its windows glowing like the eyes of a beast that never truly sleeps. And now, let's bring it all to a close. The fire crackles gently now. You've walked through centuries of blood and brilliance across foggy moors, candlelit courts and dungeons that swallowed screams. You've followed kings who ruled with cruelty, fear, obsession, madness, and occasionally a strange sort of love. You've heard whispers in stone walls and footsteps in forgotten towers. But now, the castles fade. The swords go silent. The torches gutter low. You're left with stillness. The cool weight of history pressed gently against your mind, not heavy, just grounding. You've seen that power can be lonely, that even kings wear fear like a second crown, that terrible reigns don't always begin with evil. Sometimes they begin with hope, heartbreak, or just one wrong turn. So if your eyes are growing heavy now, let them close slowly. Let the flicker of those old kingdoms dissolve behind your lids. Imagine cool linen sheets in a quiet chamber, a window cracked just enough to let in the sound of crickets and wind through ivy. The terrible kings are gone now. Their voices fade to dust. Their crowns buried their legacies caught between fact and myth. But you're safe, drifting far from their thrones into softer dreams. Sleep well, traveler of time. End of script. Sweet dreams.